So I was scrolling through YouTube and I found this video, which was made a long time ago. But the Radical Reviewer got a few things wrong in here that I just wanted to point out. For the most part, I just want to show the absurdity of what happens when we don't have private property. So let's get into it.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at capitalism and the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle, or NAP, is defined as an ethical stance asserting that aggression is inherently wrong. In this context, aggression is defined as initiating or threatening any forcible interference with an individual or individual's property.
I'm going to accept this definition of the NAP, not that it's going to matter, but we'll get into that later.
Capitalism is defined as an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Characteristics central to capitalism include private property, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, a price system, and competitive markets. Okay, so let's see if capitalism violates this non-aggression principle. Well, capitalism is characterized as private ownership of property, and property is theft, and theft is aggression.
Okay, so here's a quick syllogism of his argument. Premise 1. Capitalism is characterized as private ownership of property. Premise 2. Property is theft. Premise 3. Theft is aggression. And the conclusion. Therefore, capitalism is aggression. I added this one in here, but it's implied. To be clear, this is a valid syllogism. However, now we need to ensure that it is sound. The first premise is correct, as it's only providing a definition. But the second premise is where things require some evidence. So let's look a little closer at his next claims to see if they hold up in supporting this argument.
Okay. Let's look at it a little closer. Private ownership of land is theft. Let's take a square of land, let's say 50 acres. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's say I want to own this part by the river and build a factory that uses the water. Or maybe I want to privately own this piece of land and cut down the trees to sell for lumber. Now, some problems emerge. 1. What happens to the land has far-reaching implications. Perhaps my riverside factory limits access to water, or pollutes the water. Perhaps the deforestation leads to increased landslides and flooding, etc., etc. These impacts are certainly aggressive.
So here's his first argument for evidence of premise 2. What happens to the land has far-reaching implications. Perhaps my riverside factory limits access to the water or pollutes it. Perhaps deforestation, such as cutting down trees, leads to increased landslides and flooding. These impacts are aggressive. First of all, we need to clarify what we're talking about. While it's true that using land can have far-reaching implications, the severity of the impacts can vary greatly depending on specific circumstances. There's also ambiguity of the term aggressive. Aggression can be interpreted in various ways. Is harm in this sense literal physical threat? Is it a threat to someone else's property? Is it an indirect threat down the line if it restricts the access to food and water? So let's give the charitable approach and steelman this case. Let's say a factory owner pollutes a river, which causes the river to go bad, taking away an additional water source for a nearby town. This pollution does not directly harm the individuals, but indirectly harms the town by reducing its available water supply. So first we'll define aggression in the context of the non-aggression principle. This typically refers to the initiation of force or fraud against another person or their property. It implies a direct violation of someone else's rights, such as physical harm or the taking or damaging of property without consent. The factory's pollution of the river does not involve direct physical aggression against the town's residents or their immediate property. Instead, it degrades a shared resource, which indirectly impacts the town by reducing their water supply options. Since we know that it's not direct harm, let's explore further the concept of indirect harm. Although the harm is indirect, it still results in a negative impact on the town's ability to access water. From a broader interpretation of aggression, especially considering environmental and community impacts, one could argue that the factory's actions are indirectly aggressive. This is because they impose a cost on others without their consent by degrading a shared resource they depend on. So, in this definition, he would be correct. However, is he suggesting that everyone should avoid indirect harm? And is there a line to how much indirect harm can be caused? If there is a line set, is that line arbitrary? In other words, what would a life look like that avoids indirect harm? Let's consider a simpler example to illustrate how difficult it would be to live if one had to avoid all indirect harm. We'll use the scenario of a person living in a modern city and their daily activities. Alex is a software developer living in a modern city. Let's follow Alex through a typical day and see how much indirect harm he is inflicting upon the world around him. So, Alex wakes up in the morning and turns on the lights, except he's already committed a sin. The electricity is generated by a power plant that emits pollutants, contributing to air quality issues and climate change. Alex then takes a shower, and now he's an even worse human being since he's using water that comes from a river, partially diverted for city use. This impacts downstream ecosystems. Alex eats breakfast, which includes imported fruits. The transportation of these fruits emits greenhouse gases. He's such a jackass. Next, Alex drives to work, emitting exhaust fumes that contribute to air pollution and health issues for others. Alternatively, Alex could take the bus, which still contributes to pollution, though less per person than driving. At work, Alex uses a computer. The production of electronics involves mining rare earth metals, often with significant environmental and social impacts, including horrible third world working conditions. The office is air conditioned for comfort, consuming energy and contributing to emissions. Man, Alex is a criminal. For lunch, Alex goes to a restaurant. The restaurant's operations involve waste production, energy use, and food sourcing, all of which have negative environmental impacts. At home, Alex watches a movie online, which requires data centers consuming vast amounts of electricity. This further contributes to an environmental impact that can be considered negative. Alex also connects with friends on social media, which also relies on data centers and has indirect social impacts, like contributing to mental health issues. But worst of all, it gives more profit to corporatist greed, reinforcing their behavior. Finally, any product Alex buys, from clothing to household items, has a supply chain with environmental and social impacts. But fear not, comrades. We will build a new lifestyle for Alex to make him a changed man. We will build him into a person that avoids all forms of harm. If Alex wanted to avoid all indirect harm, he would have to make some drastic changes to his lifestyle. So here's how it might look. Alex would need to construct his own shelter using natural and sustainably sourced materials from his immediate environment. This would avoid the indirect harm associated with construction materials, transportation, and labor practices. The shelter would lack conventional utilities like electricity, water, and sewage systems that contribute to environmental and social impacts. Alex would grow his own food, relying solely on what he can cultivate himself without the use of commercial fertilizers, pesticides, or machinery that has environmental impacts. He would also avoid imported foods. In addition to farming, Alex might hunt or gather food from the local environment, such as dumpsters, ensuring that these practices do not disrupt ecosystems or deplete resources unsustainably. Alex would collect and purify water from natural sources like rainwater, streams, or wells, avoiding municipal water systems that impact ecosystems and involve energy consumption. Alex could use small-scale renewable energy sources like solar panels or wind turbines that he can build and maintain himself, avoiding the indirect harm from large-scale energy production. He would primarily use manual tools for tasks, avoiding the indirect harm of manufacturing and using electric or fuel-powered machinery. Alex would avoid all motorized transportation, relying solely on walking or biking to reduce emissions and environmental impacts. He would try to live in a self-sufficient community, or in isolation to minimize the need for travel. Alex would avoid most modern technology, including computers, smartphones, and the internet, due to the environmental and social impacts of their production and use. Communication would be limited to face-to-face interactions with nearby individuals, avoiding the indirect harm of telecommunications infrastructure. Alex would make his own clothing and goods from sustainably sourced local materials, avoiding this indirect harm associated with manufacturing, transportation, and labor practices. He would adopt a minimalist lifestyle, using only essential items to reduce the environmental and social impacts of consumption. Alex would practice zero-waste living, composting organic matter and repurposing or recycling all materials to avoid contributing to landfill and pollution. That means no trash cans. Alex would likely need to move away from the city to live in isolation or in a small self-sufficient community that shares these principles to avoid the indirect harm associated with broader societal participation. He would avoid participating in the conventional economy, instead relying on bartering or self-sufficiency to meet his needs. And if you say any of that is ridiculous, then show me where. If Alex stops this lifestyle, he will be indirectly harming others. And I thought indirect harm was bad. So, is it bad or is it not? Well, you're probably going to say that, okay, obviously we can't live like that. So why don't we just try to reduce as much indirect harm as possible? And then I would ask you, okay, where do you draw the line for how much indirect harm is allowed? But even then, whatever answer you give me is going to be arbitrary. So unless you want to become a literal hermit, avoiding almost every aspect of society, you must accept that indirect harm is okay. Unless you literally become a hermit and try to criticize this argument, you're committing a performative contradiction. So back to the factory owner who pollutes the river. He's not committing direct harm. After what we discussed about indirect harm, you would have to agree that this is acceptable. And again, if you disagree, then you're committing a performative contradiction unless you literally try to stop committing indirect harm yourself. So no, unfortunately, unless the pollution is directly harming someone, the factory owner is doing nothing wrong. Okay, let's move on to the second argument.
2. You can only do so much with a piece of land. Choosing to do one thing means you can't do another. You can't have a factory, a landfill, a quarry, a school, a parking lot, and a public park occupying the same plot of land. This too affects other people, again, perhaps aggressively affecting them.
You can only do so much with a piece of land because it's scarce. When you have that land, someone else can't use it, perhaps aggressively affecting them. Let's say we adopt this standard. Let's make a world where people cannot homestead land because it's aggressive to do so. In this world, all land is owned collectively by everyone. No individual group can claim exclusive rights to any piece of land. Land use decisions are made collectively, requiring consensus or majority approval. First of all, this is literally impossible. If all land is owned by everyone, then all land is owned by every person on Earth. And if use of land requires consensus or majority approval from the global population, the sheer scale of coordination needed to make decisions about land use would create massive bureaucratic inefficiencies and delays, and everyone would just die from starvation. Now remember, the radical reviewer said that it's aggressive to homestead land privately, so this is the only alternative. The only option left is global consensus. So, which is it? Are you a filthy capitalistic pig? Or will you die from starvation while counting the global vote for who owns what property? And most importantly, what makes it right or wrong to choose one or the other? What is the normative framework here? Moving on to the third supportive argument.
3. By privately owning land which produces profit, I can pass that profit down through the generations so that each generation increasingly unfairly benefits from my initial theft of the land, as the Morgans and Rockefellers and DuPonts and other family dynasties certainly demonstrate.
The radical reviewer says, by producing wealth through the private land, one can pass down that wealth to their descendants so that each generation unfairly gains profit. Now, to be completely honest with you, I literally can't even see how this is either fair or unfair. Which do you want? A selfish father that spent all his money he earned on himself, or a father that saved all his money and didn't use it, instead leaving it to his kids? I literally can't see why this is wrong in any way, so I'm going to need a further explanation why.
Before, there's only so much land, and even less of that land is prime real estate with access to a river or a forest or precious metals, for example. So why is it that I get the land and not someone else? In fact, let's look at all the land that is currently in private hands. Okay, so who owned that land before the... Okay, what about before them? And before them? And before them? If you look, any land that claims to be owned by private hands was at one point unowned. And that's the trick. Unowned is just a fallacious term for owned by everyone, or owned in common. So any private ownership of land is in fact stolen land, stolen from everyone else. Hence Proudhon's famous anarchist phrase, property is theft.
There is only so much land. In other words, property is scarce. Yes, I agree. There is only so much land. And this brings us back to the second argument. Do you want private property or do you want public property? Do you want individuals to own the land or do you want the entire world to share it collectively? Again, in one scenario, everyone dies, and maybe the other one's bad, but it's all that's left. Okay, I'm sorry, I can't respond to the rest of the video. I already watched the whole thing, and it's basically just an extrapolation of the 4 arguments he gave here. So yeah, my brain is rotting from going through these incredibly stupid scenarios. So that's all you're gonna get from me today. Radical Reviewer, I'm sorry bro, but in your world, we would all die. If you just thought for a minute about the implications of trying to reduce indirect harm, you would realize that you're just as bad as the rest of us. You are no better than the factory owner. You also contribute to pollution and corporatist greed. So yeah, I'm done here. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.